Hi everybody. Sorry, this is take two for us. We've just done this presentation to ourselves. My name's Claire Barton. I'm a partner and architect from Haverstock. We're a practice based in London, and we do an awful lot of work with children and young people with special educational needs. So something's very close to our heart. And I'm joined today by Jane Simpson, who, if you don't already know, you definitely should know. She's the guru of all things accessible, and she was once described as the encyclopedia of inclusion. So giving her a big intro here. We want to thank a few other people today that have helped us. So Hawkins Brown have sent me lots of lovely images, and Avesso and Closomat, who are suppliers, have also got great information out there. And Alison Cook from Woodlands Mead, West Sussex, she's been supporting me. She's a moving and handling advisor. So we wanted to talk to you today about personal care and hygiene. I think it's quite a difficult subject, and I appreciate it doesn't feel like it's always the most exciting subject, but it's a really, really important subject. And when you're dealing with special schools and special needs, you know, the nitty gritty, as much as it's great to talk about the conceptual stuff, the nitty gritty and what makes the school operate on a day-to-day basis well is so, so important. So I really, really think that if we can support you with that, that's why we're kind of doing that today. So a hygiene room, personal care, the terminology is really important. Some schools like to call it personal care, some will call it hygiene room. So that is a really important thing to start the conversation with. We're going to talk about it today, special schools, in mainstream and in the community. So what is a hygiene room? Hygiene rooms in schools, colleges and the community allow children and young people with disabilities to live their best lives. They provide necessary practical means for assisted toileting, promoting independence, hygiene and dignity. They are therefore essential in forming part of the overall duty of care provided to children and young people by educational institutions. And I think that's so, so critical. And these words you'll hear us say a lot today: dignity, independence, practicality, spaces that are comfortable, spaces that are calming, spaces with lots of assistance, ergonomics, the moving, the handling, the health and safety, and the hygiene. It's really, really important that we think about all of these things when we're dealing with this nitty-gritty, the independence of the child, the dignity of that child. So we'll talk about that a lot as we go through. So the first thing I just wanted to talk about was, sorry, I'm not very good at moving my slides on. I've got lots of things going on here and it's all a bit too crazy. So wet change and dry change. So just very, very quickly, wet change and dry change. A wet change is exactly what it says. It's a space that will have a shower in. It will often have a sluice in. It will almost certainly definitely have a floor gully to make all of those things happen. And it's a space where children are being showered down. Quite often, the wet bed will be connected back into the sluice. A dry change, sometimes it does have a shower, but sometimes it's just about using wet wipes to change the children. So they don't always need all the complications of the shower and the gully. But again, there's a very important thing to get clarity on when you're doing the briefing. How many wet change, how many dry change, what does that client need? So we're going to talk today about these settings in special schools, in mainstream and in the community. And they're all very slightly different, but we just want to talk about them all. And the first thing we wanted to talk about is wheelchairs and turning circles, which again will come up over and over again. It's really important to understand that there are very different types of wheelchair users. Some wheelchair users are actually very able and very ambulant, and actually their wheelchairs are the kind of more standard wheelchairs that the 1500 turning circle works perfectly well. In special schools, there's a lot of children with very rigid limbs, very different types of wheelchairs, where the turning circle of 1500 just doesn't work anymore. And as a practice, we work with a 1750 or an 1800 turning circle more and more. But actually in the changing places guidelines, which is the hygiene spaces that are at communities, they talk about this box, which is the 1625 by 2275. So, you know, really even bigger. And we have a growing need for more bariatric users. So this is showing you this slide is showing you a bariatric wheelchair, and obviously the turning circles are just getting bigger and bigger. So these are really critical things when your starting point for any design is to get this right, talk to your school, perhaps even measure some of their biggest wheelchairs in the school. There's a really brilliant guide in the BSA 300 which talks about this, talks about electrically propelled wheelchairs, their turning circles. I would advise everyone to go away and have a look at this. I'm now going to pass over to Jane, who's going to start working up in detail and going through the steps and layers of a hygiene room.
Good morning, everybody. It is quite a complicated issue to discuss in such a short space of time, but I'll try and fill you in with some basics. One of the things I would say straight away is do not underestimate the need for space. It's inclusion, you know, actually needs space. You can't do much without that space. But it's not just about the space, it's about careful planning. If you plan the layout correctly, you can get the maximum usage out of it. And some of the key dimensions are things like 1,000 to 1,400 mil transfer spaces to the side of a peninsula toilet, so that you've got the capacity to actually self-transfer people across. As Claire's covered already, the turning circles are rectangle. If you note on the drawings we've got there, they always specify generally an outward opening door. Now, there is an issue with that you cannot have an outward opening door on a corridor or a means of escape route unless it's recessed, and quite often that is not practical. So if you open it inwards, it becomes even more critical that you understand where all the equipment is, what the layout is. What you need to do is look at that layout, work out where the door needs to go. The door may need to go in a different position than shown on the drawing. That's not important. What's important is making sure that you can get in, use the facilities. And again, with the turning circles, my biggest issue is that, as Claire mentioned, you know, we have this 1,500 in our heads. That's not adequate. It's not adequate when you're dealing with something like a changing places or a hygiene room. I think I'll just, can you move on to the next slide, Claire? I think on that one. Okay, yeah, so hoists, what are they? You know, they are literally the H frame or the XY frame, whichever way you want to call it different things. The reason that's a much better solution than having just a single linear line or a mobile hoist is the linear line, for instance, doesn't reach all areas. So if there is, unfortunately, an accident and somebody falls onto the floor, you cannot help support them. It gives them that full flexibility to move that person around the whole space. The difficulty with mobile hoists is they do actually require more space. So actually, when we're talking about space, if you've got a proper H-frame, XY frame hoist, they're far, far better for getting people around. There are also going to be issues around, do you want it to go through into another space? So you may want to go from physio into a toilet, for instance, or something like that. Then look at that. That might need to go through the door. Plan it early because it will have an impact on not just the door, but the ceiling above and everything else. Okay. So in terms of hoists, they're really good because they help reduce staff injuries. Obviously got the capacity for them to carry. You've only got so many, I can't remember what the weight is, but a person can only carry a certain amount. You can make sure they go back to a recharge station so that they actually recharge so that they don't come to them and they've actually failed to, you know, they've got the actual capacity to operate. And make sure that you get a provider you trust, a supplier, and also make sure long-term maintenance, can you trust them? You want it to be on a long-term maintenance strategy so you can actually move it forward. Next one, please, Claire. Changing bed, lots to consider. In fact, I had a quick chat with Nick Kent this morning about them. You know, Claire's described wet or dry change, wall mounted or movable. In secondary schools, I would generally recommend, because the larger children, you would want it movable to get both sides. That isn't necessarily what people want. I think the debate is open on here. I think there's advantages and disadvantages in both systems, and you need to understand what works for you, particularly if you're dealing with an existing building, you've got restricted space. Having one fixed to a wall means you can fold it up out of the way and you've got a lot more circulation space. You've got to look at side guards. Do you do electric or hydraulic? Electric, if it's a fixed one, you can actually have it mains supplied rather than a charger. They vary enormously. And as Claire said, some can be directly attached to a sluice. You've got to make sure your hose is long enough to get to your actual bed, so you actually wash people down. And the debate will go on, and budget obviously is one of those issues. And you really want to think about, what do you want to use that space for? Is it wet? Is it dry? And I'm going to come on to one which is a bit more of a super one. If you want to move the slide on, please, Claire. I'm sorry I'm talking quite fast, but I've got a lot to get through. The training WC is critical, and you need larger spaces. So there's a couple of examples here about a training toilet. I think that's the very start of it. If you're dealing with children who potentially are going to be more independent, I would always recommend you have a larger standard WC so they get used to it, start to understand when they go out into public accessible toilets how they can use it. It's a huge learning tool. The more independent you can allow a child, if you can allow the child the dignity that they can actually take themselves to the toilet, sort themselves out and get out, that is huge. Peninsula toilet, I would say, is always to be used where it's assisted. The corner arrangement is independent use. So please try not to have the peninsula toilet where you're going to have a child that could possibly use it independently, because if they slip off the other side, it could be quite problematic. Primaries, consider the height of grab rails. BB 102 did give you some advice on heights for different age children. Think about it. And also seat heights. In some aspects I've dealt with, we've put in domestic height toilets because children are used to that at primary school. But if you imagine, a primary school pupil would not necessarily be able to get onto what is a class as a standard Part M WC. So adjustable equipment. Children will vary hugely. You know, if you've got if you go through school going from 3 to 18, actually having adjustable sinks in particular is really helpful because it allows people to be able to use it and suit their needs. And I think costs are coming down quite a lot on these now. People start to understand they're actually important. Think about autistic children. I know that there is a need for hygiene rooms within autistic units or ASD areas, but do you really need the rails, or can they not be there? Can you have portable ones? Can you have the ones that clip off and you put a plate over them? I'm thinking about the safety aspects. But also, the other one is the alarm pull. It's really exciting to go and pull something bright red. If the cord is only being used by staff, why can't that be a button? It could be more discreet, it could be out of the way. It doesn't need to be on show. Next slide, please. Okay, final bits. It's not really some of the final bits. Really, as I mentioned at the beginning, space is absolutely critical. In schools, you've got storage, you've got modesty screens, they take up so much space and impact on the circulation. So locating them carefully in the right place is really key. Equipment storage needs to be close to hand. I'm sure you're aware there's pads, there's wipes, catheters, there's slings, there's all sorts of things. And each child may need their own sort of personalised pigeonhole for their stuff that they need in that particular location. Modesty screens, you want them for support training, and frequently in hydrotherapy environments, you may well have several wet, dry beds lined up, and you will need modesty screens. Think about all those bits of kit. I did actually go into one once, and they'd forgotten that there was an H-frame in there, and they'd put a ceiling mounted curtain. It didn't last very long. As soon as they moved the hoist, the whole thing came down, taking half the ceiling with it. So just think about all the bits of kit that need to go in there. Next one, please. Right, super hygiene, 20 square metres. We would advise that every PML school has one of these. I call them the, what do I call them? I had a name for them. The all singing, all dancing hygiene room. Basically, as Claire talked about the wet and dry, there will be some children who have far more needs and may need almost bathing. So what you could have here is, but you do need that extra space. These are the ones where your bed may sort of connect directly to the sluice. You've got turning spaces need to meet larger needs. If you're thinking about even 1.8, seriously, if you're looking at some of the larger chairs, they could be 2.3 sort of turning circles by the time you've got a couple of members of staff assisting that child. So you could have a shower seat for extra independence. And remember that all of the standards we're quoting now are not tested out in the UK for bariatric users. So bariatric users, we are looking at probably 2.3 turning circle, and you've also got weight considerations, because obviously if they do get transferred onto a toilet, it won't necessarily take their weight. Okay, next one, please. And if I'm missing anything, Claire, jump in. These are a few shots of some hygiene rooms. I really just want to show that, you know, they can be very user-friendly. This one's one of Claire's at City School. So thank you for some of these images. Next one. And this one is another one of Haverstock's Liberty School. It's just showing the variety that you can actually get. This one's a Hawkins Brown, isn't it? I love that one because the tonal contrast works incredibly well. Another Hawkins Brown one. And the next slide will pop on some more detail. Right, mainstream schools. We were having a conversation actually while the tech was being sorted out. And if you're dealing with a mainstream school, potentially you're going to get disabled children, wheelchair user children coming to a mainstream school. They're not necessarily classed as having an SEN. So you need to make sure that you've got capacity to deal with those children. Now, you also have in mainstream schools more likely to have third-party users and community users who are fully covered under the equality legislation, so you've got to be quite careful. Consider support training. It's really, you know, think about a dedicated area. I have done a job once where they said they didn't need one, but we created a room large enough with a wide enough door, with water supply and a capped off floor drain, and also that the ceiling was capable of taking a hoist. I think it was about 3 weeks before it was due to open. Their new wonderful accessible school, a pupil wanted to come to it, so suddenly the meeting room was now back to being a hygiene room, which it should have been in the first place. And the last slide, and I'll just talk about this quite swiftly because I've probably gone over. Changing places came into the regulations, building regulations, in 1st of January with a 2-month lead-in time. It's only for certain sizes and certain capacities. Schools are actually excluded from it. There are 6 categories. There's assembly, recreation, I think it is, shopping, retail, sports and leisure, hospitals, crematoriums. The assembly area covers quite a lot of areas, including colleges and universities that are open to the public. I would also advise that you have a carer's rinse space in any changing places or hygiene room, because you would like to keep that sink for the disabled person to use. You do not want the carer going in after they've cleaned somebody up and using it. I think we've now got 1,200 registered places under the scheme in the UK. And for those of you who work with local authorities, there's now been 30 million allocated to local authorities to install changing places in existing buildings. But they will be inviting you to opt in soon, so please keep an eye out for that. And now I'll pass you back to Claire.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was so useful. I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures of some changing places now. So these are this is the one on the left is from a hospital in Leicester. And then the other 2 are Tesco have rolled out a whole programme of changing places. And you can see in the bottom picture here a bariatric bed. So we have fitted quite a lot of bariatric beds now in some of our secondary schools where we've got much larger users. Exactly as Jane said, a lot of the standards now don't necessarily take account of that. So it's something we've really got to consider and really talk to our clients about. This is just an example of changing places where they have tried to use some really kind of classier materials and just really make it not look institutional. And this is Legoland. Legoland have got a whole series of changing places as well. I just wanted to talk to you a little about innovation, and Jane's already touched on it, but just this idea of adjustable kit. We're fitting a lot more adjustable kit now. As Jane said, it's just so much more mainstream, and there's electric and a kind of more manual adjustable. So it is becoming affordable, and it is something that you should all be looking into with your schools. I think it's pretty standard now that most schools would expect an adjustable sink. The other thing we're seeing more and more in schools, and it might just be in one space, but would be a super loo, the loos that kind of do all the cleaning and do everything, and that's becoming really, really popular. And I think it's I know they're detailed conversations, but it's really important you have them with your clients, because this is their day to day. This is what they deal in. And if this doesn't work, then, you know, this will be what their feeling with their school is about, that the nitty gritty doesn't work. And I mean, we haven't had the opportunity to do really innovative things recently because, you know, obviously we're constrained by budget, but during BSF we were really getting going with this kind of idea of innovation and how special some of these spaces could feel. And I can't remember whether I told you or whether I did it in our previous presentation, because this is Mark too, but when we were talking to Alison, she was talking about children that won't go in hygiene spaces because they're too scared, and that is so worrying, and it just makes you realise how comfortable and welcoming these spaces need to feel. So in the distant past, we did have aromatherapy in these spaces, so children can choose their own smell when they go in. We had iPads that were connected to lights and music, so they could have their own music and they had their own lights, and even projections. So I think thinking about lighting is really, really important, because those young people are staring up. So making sure that it's lighting that is calming and soft, and doesn't, you know, make them agitated and make them scared. So that's a really important thing. So there is lots of great things, you know, every hygiene room and every personal care space, it should be designed. And I really just would implore you all just to take a few minutes to think about those spaces really carefully and really make them the very best you can, because some young people will spend an awful lot of time in them. I think we're done. I think we're ready for questions. If there are any. That sounds like we've told you everything you need to know, or there's absolutely no one listening to this talk. It's quite an unnerving setup, because we can't see anybody. Thank you, David.
I think we have to tell them everything.
Yeah. Well, we're going to make this presentation available as well. So, yeah, I have a lot to say about this. We have a question come up on a couple of projects. Access to a hygiene room from both a corridor and a classroom. Any thought? Oh, I mean, I don't know if you mean one hygiene room accessible from both. That is possible. It's kind of like a Jack and Jill scenario, isn't it? I guess ultimately you just have to make sure you're ensuring that the door is locked to keep the dignity of the user inside. I think this conversation about hygiene rooms off classrooms is really, really critical. I know that space is really, really tight, but the general view that I get from schools, the more and more we spend time with them, even at primary and early years level, is hygiene's off classrooms should have a lobby space if they can, because it's really, really unpleasant to have hygiene rooms that are so directly off a classroom. And so we are still doing hygiene rooms between classrooms, but we generally always try and design in a lobby. And actually, as a sense of progression and as children are getting older and independence, we find that hygiene rooms should really be off a corridor. And in a way, that could be the way that it changes, especially in an all-through school where children are there for an awful lot of their life. So showing that change is really, really important. With the bed, can you design for both sides assistance needed? Well, yeah, that's what we were effectively showing in our examples. Is we're showing that in a primary school, the preference is definitely to have the bed against the wall, but in a secondary school with a larger user where it's more handling for the carers. Like Jane said, there's two schools of thought on it, but some people would prefer to be able to have a carer either side of the bed, and that's why we would say, as a the size for a minimum primary would be 12, but for a secondary, we think the minimum is 15 because of the need to have that. But again, it's something to talk to your client about. If they're happy to have it against the wall, then, you know, that's a conversation to be had. But I think you'll find 12 very, very difficult if you've got a bed where they want assistance both sides.
Claire, can I just say that there's also the issue if there are two doors going into, if quite often they have a shared between classrooms, and it causes quite a problem, because then where do you fit all the equipment? How do you get it in? Yeah. It actually does cause loads of problems. And I think it's the ones where they've got those double doors, there's a privacy issue, there's a dignity issue. So you need to think about how do the locks work, and can, when one is unlocked, can the other one lock? But, you know, the maglock type scenarios. Because what you don't want, particularly if it's off a corridor and under classroom, is somebody going in from the corridor and there's a child in there already. So it is quite complicated, and it's a management headache, really.
I think I would be pushing them to go for one off the corridor and not off the classroom. My preference is those off the corridor, because ultimately it's more flexible for more people to use it as well. If it's off a classroom, it can then only be used by those children. So I would always, and I just think the kind of environmental health of it, I think that personally, I think I would always push to have them off corridors if you can. But we have seen some great setups in primary. I think there was a few images where they have the kind of lobby, and then at one side there's kind of lots of training, accessible toileting for the more independent user, and then on the other side of the lobby is a hygiene space. So it's a real kind of training environment, and I think you know, that is a great option at early years and primary level.
My school of thought is that you need one of these super duper ones, which should be off a corridor, so anybody can use it. It can come from any age range. But we should be looking at toilets and not just having the ADM WC and having the ambulance WC and that. We should be having a range of toilets that meet people's needs. I mean, the ADM toilet, I think when Bob Feeney did the research, he established at that point in time only met 60% of wheelchair user needs. And if you look at the HBNs, I think it's 0002 sanitary, it outlines the space. And I think it's about, if you do a 1.9 by about a 2.3 or 4 accessible WC, his research showed it met 90% of wheelchair user needs. So we need to get away from this kind of, that's a toilet, that's a hygiene room or a changing room. We need to think about what are those spaces used for.
Absolutely, absolutely. I do agree. And I agree about having lots of different things, because ultimately it's a life skill. And we are trying to push young people to be more independent. So having a range of different options, peninsula, some corners, you know, that's giving them that kind of that's the real world. That's what they will meet when they go out into the real world. And we do schools like that, where there's different types of doors. There's they'll have a right-hand corner and a left-hand corner. They'll have a peninsula. They'll have a hygiene, a super hygiene. You know, they'll have every version, so that they can prepare their young people.
There's a question about official CP standards and suggestions. I think the CP standards are great, but again, if you look at the building regulations, it's within reason. The aim should be for that, and I know when you deal with existing buildings, that's not always possible. And I think you can specify it as a CP room, but somewhere on the website of the building that you specify that it's slightly smaller than standard, so people aren't getting there and going, I can't use it, it doesn't suit me. But if you think about the fact that a lot of people, if you look at the campaigns, were changing their children, particularly on floors of accessible toilets, you know, anything is better than that, to be quite honest. But the more we can get in, and as I say, I think there are 1,200 changing places now. They're putting them in service stations. They've just announced this extra money, so hopefully, and again, I think the Tesco's one, I think they put 100 in, something like that. So we're getting to the stage now where we really ought to be looking and having a full record of where they all are. But the bigger, the better, please, with the equipment laid out in the right place. Are there any more questions? Can I see any more or not? Or is that it?
I think we might be done. Anyway, I mean, Jane and I are very easy to contact if anybody does need any more support. So I think we should leave it there, and then, you know, if you have any offline questions, then feel free to send them through, and we're more than happy to chat about it.
So we say bye?
I think that's it.